of the Blitz. Caring for the injured.
Bombs would be raining around them and they'd be still in the operating theatres.
And feeding a hungry nation. These are the extraordinary stories of Britain's home front heroes. Today, TV presenter Radzi Chinyanganya discovers his grandmother's role in keeping wartime Scotland fed.
And it's Tommy and Billy.
He makes an emotional journey to his granny's farm.
To be here has exceeded every expectation I think I had. What a lady.
Gets a taste of a 1940s diet.
Eggs. I like omelettes.
Yeah, but people were rationed to one a week.
And finds out how hundreds of men from the Caribbean braved the bleak Scottish winters to do their bit for Britain.
Oh, there it back comes.
Whoa! Timber! Awesome.
Yeah.
Radzi Chinyanganya has been a presenter on Blue Peter since 2013.
Welcome to Blue Peter.
He was born and brought up in Wolverhampton to a Scottish mother and a Zimbabwean father.
They met in the 1970s. My dad saw my mum walking down the corridor and thought, that's the gal for me.
Radzi is proud of his Scottish ancestry and especially proud of his grandparents, who both took an active role in World War II. But while he knows much more about his late grandfather's role fighting in Italy, he knows precious little about the crucial role his grandmother, Annie, undertook on Britain's home front.
My grandparents have got quite an interesting story because they met during the Second World War when my granddad was located up in Thurso in Falkirk. During the war, my granddad served, and I believe he went to the Sahara Desert. I believe he was in Italy, which is where he lost his leg. But my granny, I don't know much about her story. And I'm actually really fascinated to find out because I know she was based on a farm. I know she would have been young. And I knew she actually brought up her younger brother with her older sister. It was really difficult, and she made a lot of personal sacrifice. And that is actually about all I currently know.
Annie's parents died when she was just 17, leaving her to run the farm and bring up her younger brother George alongside her sister Margaret.
This for me is a journey in every sense of the word. It's a journey to help me discover how my granny, at just 17 years old, made a contribution to the war effort. But it's also a journey to the very north of Scotland to see the farm that she actually grew up on and find out just what that must have been like for her.
Before war broke out, 75% of Britain's food was imported by ship, leaving the country vulnerable to a German U-boat blockade that would put vital supplies under threat and create a real risk of starvation. By 1941, annual food imports had halved. The government was desperate to increase food production by reclaiming pasture and unused land in order to grow more crops and double the annual yield. 6.5 million acres had to be ploughed and put to seed. For Radzi's 17-year-old grandmother Annie, this meant changing the farm's usage from grazing land to planting and growing crops. And this required much more manpower. But with an estimated 50,000 farm workers having been lost to the armed forces, who would do all this extra work? The answer, for many farms like Annie's, was the Women's Land Army.
All thanks and honor to the land girls who are doing this magnificent job. Won't you come and join them?
As Radzi heads through Scotland towards his granny's farm, his first stop is to meet one of the so-called land girls, to find out why their role was so important. 94-year-old Mona MacLeod was just 17 when she left home like thousands of other young women to work on the land and help stop the nation going hungry.
It's an absolute pleasure to meet you. What I'd love to find out about your story is it sort of runs parallel with my granny's story. You were a Land Army girl. How did that come about for yourself?
My father came down a fortnight after Dunkirk and said, Mona, I believe, as I always have done, in the importance of the higher education of women. But he said, I think we must concentrate on winning the war. And so it was my father who recruited me for the Land Army. And I, being an obedient daughter, just did what my father told me to do.
So he was the one who ultimately moved you to Scotland.
He proposed that I should go to the university farm. He had a chair at the university, you see. And then he discovered that the university farm was surrounded by army, and he was a world expert in venereal disease. And he decided he didn't want his daughter to be amongst those soldiers. So I was sent to Scotland, where I think he thought that men were nicer.
Much cleaner.
Quite.
At its peak, the Women's Land Army had 80,000 members, initially volunteers, then from 1941 conscripted. And the work of the Land Girls was incredibly wide-ranging, from milking cows, lambing and managing poultry, through ploughing, gathering crops and digging ditches, to carrying out farm maintenance and even catching rats.
It was very hard. It was exactly the same as the men did. I worked a 10-hour day. You started work at 7 and went on till 6. And that was a normal working day. If you're strong enough to do it, hard work makes you healthy. But you've got to be strong enough. And as it happened, I was.
In terms of the jobs you actually did on the farm, did you have an absolute worst?
Yes. Hoeing turnips. Deadly boring. The same thing, backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards.
What sort of clothes did you have to wear for that?
Uniform was totally inadequate. It was neither elegant nor good for working in. I discovered that my brother's old clothes were much more comfortable. And so I really got on much better once I got his old trousers. And then my grandmother had got woolen knickers that came to there, and they helped. But it was tough.
Just how important were the Land Army to the Second World War?
You were conscious all the time that you were doing something that was really useful. And there aren't many times in your life when you feel quite sure what you're doing is really very useful. You knew that you had to produce food, because the more you could grow at home, the better.
Despite the challenges of adapting to country life, the contribution of women like Mona was key to victory on the home front. And to get a clearer understanding of their role, Radzi is meeting historian Elaine Edwards, curator of a Land Girls exhibition at the National War Museum.
All of them have gone through, so that means that the bigger ones, they're all fairly small, and then you can sort them out, and then the little ones, underneath, you've got your new potatoes underneath there.
Yes, we do. I've just met the incredible Mona. Is this the sort of thing they would have done back then?
Yep, absolutely. Pulling potatoes, along with many other jobs. Yep, how Kintatties, as they would have been known in this area.
Yeah. Well, I'll happily sort these while I talk to you.
Okay.
Just how desperate was the situation back then?
Well, because of the blockades with U-boats and what have you, attacking our shipping, it was getting quite desperate. The Land Army started in the First World War, and in 1917 we only had 3 weeks' supply of food left. So
3 weeks?
3 weeks' supply of food left.
Desperate to never be put in that position again, the government reintroduced the Land Army in June 1939, 3 months before the war began, to prepare Britain to be self-sufficient.
What was the perception of essentially a civilian army, but a female one at that?
Yeah, there was a reluctance, shall we say, among a lot of the farmers to take on Land Girls. partly because they were female, partly because they were coming from the towns and therefore no experience of working with agriculture. And a number of farmers preferred to take prisoners of war, so they would rather have had Germans or Italians on their land than land girls.
And is that essentially because they were women?
Yeah, that did break down fairly quickly when the land girls proved their worth.
And so how successful was the campaign?
Hugely successful. At its height, there was 80,000 women in the Land Army, 8,500 in Scotland. Another 500,000 acres were put under the plough into food production during the period of the Second World War, and that made the difference between survival and not.
How much do you think we actually owe as a country to people like Mona?
I think we owe a vast amount, and I think it is really important that future generations realise just what we do owe to them, because it's hugely significant to the success of the Second World War.
I am genuinely mesmerised after today, and it's left me with more questions than answers, because my granny was 17 when she worked on her farm. So did people like Mona work with people like my granny?
The Land Army will never be forgotten by the grateful nation it fed throughout the war.
I think the attractive thing about the Land Army girls was they all were in uniform and felt that, you know, they were doing their bits and they did the men's work.
Throughout the war, they grew everything that we ate, drank the milk from the cows they milked.
They did the haymaking, the sowing, and gathering the crops.
To ensure that everybody got a fair share of the food we did have, rationing was introduced on the 8th of June 1940. Families registered with a shopkeeper who was issued with just enough food for the people on his list.
These little books may seem a bit complicated at first, but their purpose is quite simple. They mean that if, in the course of the war, we are short for a time of this or that article of food, rationing will give everyone, rich and poor alike, an equal share of all that's going.
The Ministry of Food was responsible for overseeing rationing. Every man, woman and child was given a ration book with coupons. As shortages increased, long queues became routine, and it was common for someone to reach the front of the queue only to find the item they had been waiting for had sold out. Armed with a shopping list, Radzi is ready to do the weekly shop 1940s style.
Eggs. Butter, margarine and cooking fats.
In 1940, there were restrictions on what people could buy.
Bacon, yes, that's on the list.
Basics like bacon, butter and sugar were rationed.
Next thing, tea.
There was a thriving black market, and by March 1941, over 2,000 people were prosecuted for either fraud or dishonesty.
Milk, yes, that's on the list.
By 1942, many other foodstuffs, including meat, milk, cheese, eggs and cooking fat, were also on the ration. Radzi is happy with what he thinks is his weekly shop. But nutritionist and food expert Kate Swain is about to burst his bubble.
I've come prepared. I have my list and I have my ration shopping complete for the week.
Okay, so you think this is what you've got for the week?
Yeah, I'm hoping it's not nearly enough.
I'm going to disappoint you a little bit because this is way too much. You have too much here for 1 week of food.
Okay, let's start with the bacon then.
So you've got about 8 slices here, and what you'd actually have for 1 week is 4. So we've got 1, 2, and then 3, 4. That would be your allowance for a week.
Okay, that's really not very much.
So you've got this whole thing of butter. I'm afraid that what you've actually got is about 50 grams. There you go. That's your butter for the week. And that's exactly the same with the cooking fat or the lard and the margarine.
I am blown away at how little this is here. Okay, hopefully you're now going to say This is enough for a week.
That's got to last you for 2 months.
2 months?
Yeah, 2 whole months, that 1 jar of jam. So it's quite hard, isn't it?
Eggs. I like omelettes.
Yeah. Eggs are really good for you, but people were rationed to 1 a week.
That's one that shocks me the most because eggs are in so many things.
They were supplemented. They were supplemented with dried egg powder, but it probably didn't have quite the same taste.
Okay, if we're going to be serious for a moment, how on earth would you make this stretch for the necessary time?
Well, there was lots of government schemes. The Ministry of Food had a big campaign so that people knew how to eat well. That involved leaflets, that involved food flashes. Really giving people good instructions on what to do with some of these ingredients.
One pays good dividends in taste, this one. The other comes in useful in case, this one.
You would be using things that weren't rationed. So things like more grains, you'd be using pulses, vegetables. So people were very much encouraged to grow their own vegetables. There was a campaign called Dig for Victory.
Dig for victory. Thousands of people have discovered that a 10-rod plot will keep a family of 5 in vegetables 8 months of the year.
So the staples that we know now, potatoes, carrots, things that grow easily, became a really big part of the diet. Lots of fresh vegetables, making everything from scratch, small amounts of protein, not too much fat, and not too much sugar.
Were there any things you just physically couldn't get?
Well, it was really difficult to get some of the fresh fruits and vegetables that were imported. So things like bananas, people just didn't see. Coffee was almost impossible to get hold of. Chocolate was in very short supply, sugar was in limited supply.
And how were they replaced?
You have that classic example of, ice cream wasn't available, so they tried to put carrots on sticks and give that to children.
Oh, come on, sis. We might as well. Hang the expense. They're awfully good for you.
Which, okay, is not the same thing, but is far more nutritious. So from a nutritional standpoint, there were big improvements actually in people's health, particularly children.
There's something in this rationing. Being an adult in 2018, I think I just must take for granted the fact that I can buy whatever I have the money to pay for. The idea of not being able to buy what I want, not being allowed to buy what I want, is genuinely beyond me.
For the people who went through rationing, it was something they'd never forget.
I did eat rhubarb as a lollipop with a little bag of sugar, dipped it in, and also my grandmother used to make a cone out of greaseproof paper and put cocoa in with sugar and dip your finger in. Because there were no sweets or anything then, nothing.
We had powdered milk from the United States of America, and the powdered eggs were horrible. But we ate them, we were hungry. But they definitely had a flavour all of their own. I wouldn't recommend them.
There'd be long queues, and the word would go round, Mrs. Suchybody would whisper, they've got meat at the butcher's, or they've got meat at... And everybody would go to the butcher's.
While the work of the Land Girls is rightly celebrated, there were some unsung heroes of the home front who came from much further afield. Supplies of timber had also been cut off by the German U-boat blockade, and the nation was in desperate need of building materials.
We have lost our supplies of timber from Norway, Finland and Sweden, but our need for timber is greater than ever.
But with so many men away at war, there was a shortage of skilled labour to cut down trees. The call went out across the seas to the Commonwealth and was answered by 900 men from the Caribbean who came to Scotland to help. They were the British Honduras Lumberjacks. Radzie's meeting John Dugan from the Forestry Commission in the Forest of Duns, the place where these men from the Caribbean found themselves in the midst of a cold Scottish winter.
They arrived in the sort of late autumn into the early winter of 1941, and I think they were let down a bit in terms of the supply of good clothing. And I believe when they first arrived, the camp that they were due to use wasn't even fully constructed, so initially they had to stay in tents. So really pretty tough conditions.
And what did the local population make of them?
I think they were really quite interested in them. You've got to bear in mind 1940s rural Scotland, people really weren't that exposed to other people from other parts of the world.
Yeah.
So I think it was really quite a surprise to them, and they were really interested.
The work was hard and relentless, felling, measuring logs, loading timber onto trucks and driving huge stacks of it off to sawmills. But the work was absolutely crucial to the war effort. Britain was powered by coal, but getting coal out of the ground required pit props, and pit props require trees.
In terms of answering the call, do you know if it was an adventure to them, or was it purely just service and self-sacrifice?
I think it was a bit of both, to be honest. I mean, I think you've got young men, you know, it's a chance to go and see another part of the world, and also they had a relationship to the UK because they saw that as, you know, the core of the Commonwealth at the time. And so I think it was a really adventurous thing for them. But yeah, you look at some of the witness testimonies from them, and, you know, they were very much wanting to do something and make their contribution towards the war effort.
Forces from the British Commonwealth of Nations were involved in all the major theatres of war, as well as serving on the British home front. Over 3.5 million men from India, Canada, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand and other colonies fought alongside Britain. And having heard the story of the British Honduras lumberjacks, Radzai is keen to get a taste of what life would have been like for those men from the Caribbean. Melvin Landale is a modern-day lumberjack who works in the very same forests, although he has the advantage of very different equipment.
I can see an axe in your hand. Does that mean we're actually going to chop down a tree today?
We are going to cut down a tree today using an axe to do the front cut and then using the saw to do the back cut.
Was that actually used in the Second World War?
This is a two-man cross-cut saw, and it was these kinds of saws, yeah, that they used back then. Before the advent of chainsaws, yeah.
Back breaking, I presume?
Yeah.
Should we get cracking?
No time like the present.
Yes. I have to say, I've genuinely never seen this in the flesh before. The guys who come over from Honduras, were these the same trees that they were used to?
Oh, no, I believe these are larch, which is a softwood. I believe they were used to cutting down teak, which is a hardwood. And it's not only is it a hardwood, it's a very hard wood. So hard as this is, it'd be a lot harder cutting down teak. I'm going to come round to that side.
Fine. And Melvin, just to be clear, you've been doing this for a long, long time.
Yeah, not like this though.
But that's exactly what I mean.
But yeah, I mean, there were seriously hard, fit men, yeah.
And on rations.
God, yeah.
How much has forestry changed since the Second World War?
Oh, a huge amount, huge amount. I mean, now a lot of the forestry stuff is actually done with big machines, big diggers with grabs. They grab the tree, they cut it, it falls down, they strip the branches off, and they'll cut a tree down like this in maybe, I don't know, half a minute, something like that. Which isn't, it's a totally different ballgame now, like, you know. So, time for you to do a bit of work. Enough acting. You'll have a shot with this saw.
Oh, of course. Yes.
You're not getting to just be the pretty face, man. Okay.
This is properly old school. Okay, so far, we've done about half an inch. Is it okay to admit at this point, I'm already tired? Yikes. I don't think us millennials know how easy we've got it.
Long strokes.
This is a lot of fun, but the idea of doing this every day, rain, snow, sun, hail, wind.
Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going.
Whoa, you can hear it! That is going! Whoa! Timber! Wow!
There you go.
Now that was awesome.
Yeah, yeah.
That makes the hard work all worthwhile.
Good work, Radzai, man.
Thank you.
Well.
Oh, I know this is a normal day at the office for you, but for me, this is a special day.
Good fun.
One of the British Honduras lumberjacks who served the home front grew to love Scotland so much he chose to stay after the war. Sam Martinez left British Honduras in 1941, aged 32, and lived a long and full life in his adopted country. His grandson, Yücel, has documented that life to keep his memory alive for generations to come.
You have a very special grandfather who came from British Honduras. What was his life like back then in British Honduras?
I think his life back then was pretty special in the sense that, yes, he lived in the jungle. He had to go scavenging to get breakfast and feed his brothers and sisters.
Should we take a look at what he's got to say?
Yeah.
My parents didn't have the money to give us fancy dress or buy shoes for everybody, so we had to keep bare feet. Growing up, I had to go and fish for our breakfast before we go to school. My other brothers go to the plantation and look for potatoes or banana. If we get a ripe banana, you eat that, you go to school. You must go to school.
Do you know exactly why he went from British Honduras to Scotland?
I think they obviously knew, and they were obviously worried that if anything happened to Great Britain, it would have an effect on all the Commonwealth countries. So I think that's what inspired him to actually come over and help.
Well, the war started. We were more glad to come to Britain to help the mother country. That, according to the government here during the war, they wanted all British people to come and give a helping hand to do our bit for Great Britain.
So he goes from British Honduras, warm, Scotland, freezing. Do you know what his first impressions were?
When they arrived, he did feel the cold. They had 3 sets of uniform. They had the 3 of them on at all times. People had never seen people of colour.
Right.
So people reacted them, calling them the coalmen. The coalmen are coming.
I think they were nervous.
Oh, wow.
The women disappeared behind the shops. Even the men were shaken, more frightened probably. But it didn't take long. We became real friends. They were good to us because it was war during that time.
Yücel filmed Sam between the ages of 102 and 105 before he died in 2016, aged 106.
Every time I hear Sam speak, I can't get over just how sharp he is for a man who's over 100 years old. Do you have any idea why he actually stayed?
He was earning a bit more money. He had access to better housing facilities. He started to meet new friends and new people, and I think obviously becoming one of the first Hibernian Football Club Belize supporters.
Is that right?
Yeah. Up until he was 100, they threw him a party at his 100th birthday party.
Oh.
Obviously, past 100, he started receiving telegrams from the Queen. So his life in Edinburgh was, like, he would call himself a local celebrity. And that if he had charged £1 for every interview that he had, he would have been a millionaire.
Harold Macmillan, he was the Home Secretary at the time, looking after the colonials. He said all the men that want to stay are entitled to stay. This country is yours as well as mine. Those were his words. I was one of them that stayed. I wanted to prove how well I can live among you white people to see how well we can get on. So I took the chance and I break the ice.
Could I just ask what you've learned from him? Because I'm learning a lot just being sat here and listening to him for the few words that we're privileged to hear.
I think having the knowledge from the past helps us build the future. So in those regards, I would say that if there's still any people alive that have that kind of memories of those times, should pass on the knowledge. I think it's important for progress in our country.
I really can't tell you how I'm feeling right now. The likes of Sam took the call for the homeland, for Britain, for something bigger than himself. He wasn't from Britain, and he didn't have to do that. He chose to.
16,000 men from the Caribbean volunteered for service in World War II. Thousands of other men and women came to work in hospitals, munitions factories, and the Merchant Navy.
They came over and they'd left their families. They were fighting our war, which it was our war, and things weren't going too good at the time.
We do owe the Commonwealth a great deal of thanks for what they did during the war, but then they were all part of us, weren't they? And the Queen has acknowledged it many times, hasn't she?
We really enjoyed their company, and they enjoyed being with us. And that's the point. They were great.
Radzie's granny was just 17 when she was left in charge of a 200-acre farm as war broke out. Thanks to the Defence of the Realm Act, she was required to plant her pasture land in order to increase production. For many landowners, their farms were then worked by the land girls. But there is a surprise in store for Radzi when he finds out who farmed his family's land. Historian Muriel Murray can give him a better understanding of what took place on his granny's farm almost 80 years ago.
She would produce crops, which would be oats and barley, which at harvest time would have meant a lot of hard work. Turnips would have been grown for the cattle, for feeding the cattle, and turnips would have to be hoed to keep the rows clean and free from weeds. And there would be a lot of labour, a lot of physical labour and working on the fields.
Due to family circumstance, I understand that at about 17 years old, when the war began, my granny and her sister Margaret took over the farm themselves.
Did they?
They had about 200 acres, and that was down to them to resource the entire thing. What kind of people would they have needed to achieve that and successfully do it?
There were prisoners of war who were sent out to work on local farms because they were needed, and it also helped to employ them because you don't want idle people spending all their day in camp. That leads to trouble.
German prisoners are being used to hoe and keep down the weeds, which grow in special luxuriance at this time of year.
8 miles from Radzie's family farm was prisoner of war camp 165 Watton. The camp was divided into 2 areas. Area A held low-threat prisoners who worked on surrounding farms. Area B housed hardline and dangerous Nazis, including U-boat captain Otto Kretschmer, known as the Wolf of the Atlantic, Hitler's personal aide Max Wunsch, and Paul Werner Hopper, commandant of Stutthof concentration camp.
We actually travelled hours and hours through the rural highlands to get here. I was expecting to find possibly farms like my granny, but not high-level Nazis being based here. Why would they have done that?
I think you've answered your own question. It was a place where if they escaped, which they didn't really very much, if they escaped, there wasn't much opportunity to jump on a train or find your way back to Germany very easily. But the majority of the others who were allowed out also had quite a lot of contact with the local community. One prisoner of war married a local girl, and his occupation he is down as a cattleman at a farm on Achengills.
Was that common?
It happened. I wouldn't say it was common, but it did happen quite regularly, yes.
I'm lost for words. I genuinely am.
The role farmers played on the home front was vital to the success of the war. Without the hard work of women like Radzie's granny, Britain would have been starved into submission. Having now heard how his granny helped feed so many people during the war, he can't wait to see the farm himself for the first time. And after a journey through the rural highlands, Radzi has arrived at Falkirk in the north of Scotland to meet his uncles, Tommy and Billy.
Wow. We have arrived. Would you look at that? Billy, really good to see you.
Pleased to see you too.
And Tommy, great to see you.
And you, Radzi.
Behind us there, is that the house?
Yes, that's where your granny was born in February 1922. No electricity, no running water. There was a well further down in the field. No telephone. Fuel had to be brought in the form of peat. So things were very basic.
And the Scottish winters, they can be brutal.
Yes, but we'll soon get something to keep you warm. We'll get you working.
Coming here is an opportunity to put a more personal slant on what he's discovered about how farmers helped keep the nation fed.
Granny was born in 1922. She's 17 when the war begins.
Yes.
And she's got all that responsibility.
She was here with her sister, and very early in the war, both parents passed away within a short period of each other, which left Uncle George, a 12-year-old boy, with no parents. So they were left in order to run this place on their own. And bearing in mind it was a tenant farm, it was rented, so it had to pay.
And she's not even 20 at this stage.
No. Because there was a prisoner of war camp nearby, German and Italian prisoners were brought in to harvest potatoes, carrots, turnips and that type of thing.
Do you know anything about what they were like or how Granny found that?
Not really. I don't think that she had too much to do with them. She had more to do with the troops that were stationed locally because of the fact that there was a threat of a Nazi invasion from Norway. That's where my dad turned up.
So that's when she met my granddad, your dad, Tony.
That's right, yeah.
And in terms of granddad, I found out the most unbelievable story, but I only know snippets of it.
Initially, they heard he was missing, believed killed. That wasn't the case. He was wounded, but he lay on the battlefield for about 18 hours before he was managed to get him away from the battlefield situation and to a casualty clearance station.
So at this stage, Granny thinks that a man that she's in love with has been killed at war.
Yes, until it eventually came known that he had survived. Badly wounded, but survived.
That's like something out of a film. You'd give anything to say it can't be true, I believe that. And then to find out that it actually isn't true, well, I'm pleased he did, because if he didn't, you might not be here, and I definitely wouldn't be here.
Yeah, that's for sure.
After the war, Annie moved to Dundee, and her younger brother George took over the running of the farm until he died 3 years ago. Since then, Radzi's Uncle Billy has been in charge.
Billy, what am I looking at here? How big's the farm?
Farm is 215 acres, about 82 hectares.
It's amazing to think that this has essentially not been changed since my granny was working on it all those years ago.
That's it. It's in grass at the moment, but during the war years there would have been cropping. Yeah, oats, yeah.
One of my big memories of my granny is her making porridge in the mornings.
Yes, she would make porridge, and she used oat cakes was her speciality. Yes, yeah, lovely.
One thing that has changed since Radzi's granny was looking after the land is the machinery. Back then, horses would have been used to plough the land, but today, Radzi's going to help out using a tractor.
Right, let me get that.
Thank you. It's nice and cosy up here. Got to admit, this is my first time driving a tractor.
Pretty similar to a car.
Yes. We are in business.
I did not know that riding a tractor could be this much fun. I have to say, it all feels strangely familiar. I genuinely feel like I've been here before. I've heard stories, I've seen photos, but to be here, it has exceeded about every expectation I think I had.
Feeding the nation was an essential part of winning the war. And Radzi now knows the crucial part his granny, and people like her on the home front, played in securing that victory.
What's really taken me by surprise today is actually how emotional I feel. I feel a real sense of welcome, thanks to Billy, but also a connection being on the same land that my family, my granny and her sister Margaret worked on during the Second World War. And for me being here, it's really brought a lot home. It feels like a very special day. This journey has taken me to the far reaches of Scotland, and just look at it, it is absolutely gorgeous. But the journey's also been a personal one. I've met some fantastic people and heard some stories which has quite frankly humbled me. None more so than hearing about my granny thinking that my granddad had actually died during the Second World War. I've been surprised to hear the stories of people from the Commonwealth who still took the call. And I guess that resonates with me because in many ways I am a child of the Commonwealth. But the thing that's been most special for me has been a chance to get to go on my granny's farm, a farm I'd never been to before, and tell her story. And so many women with stories just like hers, people who contributed to the war, quietly in the background. They might not be stories which are well told or even well known, but they're stories which I think we all should know. And I hope she's really proud we've told it.
Edie Stark chats to Sir Hugh Strachan, Professor of International Relations at St Andrews University and the country's top military historian. Download BBC Sounds to listen to Stark Talk now.
They battled with courage, attacked wave after wave, but Wales held on strong. The defence would not cave. Now it's time to show Fiji why we're Scotland the brave. The autumn tests continue with Scotland versus Fiji, Saturday from 2, live on BBC One Scotland.
Who are you people?
No more lies, Charlie.
The Little Drummer Girl, Sunday at 9:30 on BBC One.
She left me no choice.
She needs me alive.
Gascon is a threat. Time is running out.
He's not getting away.
Can't be in vain. I need this.
I am in control.
There's nowhere left to run for Gaskell. Holby City, Tuesday at 10:45 on BBC One Scotland.
Are we the hunters or are we the prey? This is a wild game of survival.
This is a story of power, politics, and the fight for survival. Dynasties.
Starts with chimpanzees, Sunday at 8:30 on BBC One.
As the Prince of Wales turns 70.
He's got a big sort of heart.
And a passion. He's driven.
The man never stops.
With unique access, BBC brings a revealing and intimate portrait. He's pretty impatient.
Really? You don't say.
Prince, Son and Heir, Charles at 70, tonight at 9 on BBC One.